Hello and welcome to another episode of The Presidents and the Prime Ministers. Today we are going to talk about one of, I think, the most intriguing American presidents of all. It's Ronald Reagan. He served as president from 1981 through to 1989. And Simon Heffer has written about him in the book, and Simon joins me now. Simon, why did you particularly want to write about Ronald Reagan?
Well, I sadly am so old I can remember him becoming president. And I thought he was a terrific president. I thought he had real charisma, but also had the right values. And I thought he was a tremendous incarnation of what I'd always imagined America to be. That may be because as a child I'd been forced to watch various Ronald Reagan films with my mother, who loved Hollywood films. But he seemed to me to be the perfect representation of his country and what his country stood for. And, of course, was a great friend of and a great admirer of Mrs. Thatcher, and they were extremely close, and she occasionally spoke to me about him. And he just seemed the perfect fit for me, in that also I'm not a great expert on American history, and if you'd asked me to do President Taft or something, I might have been rather stuck, but Ronald Reagan was somebody I felt I'd experienced.
And I think it does give you a different perspective, doesn't it, when you've lived through that period. And it was the 1980s, whether it was in America or in the United Kingdom, was an iconic time in many ways. That the political weather changed, and he was one of the architects of that happening.
Yes, he was, with Mrs. Thatcher. And, of course, he came after a distressingly mediocre president in Jimmy Carter. And, I was born in 1960 and grew up as a child watching American television and being told that America was the world's leading nation. I remember men walking on the moon in 1969. And then it all started to go slightly wrong, Nixon and Watergate and Jerry Ford falling over occasionally and falling asleep with having dinner with the Queen. And then dear old Jimmy Carter, who I'm sure was a wonderful man, and I wish him an even longer life than he's having already. But he seemed to be utterly incompetent. And it's terrific to know who is allowed to play on the White House tennis courts. But if you can't manage international relations and you are the world's leading superpower, you have a problem. And I just remember the Iran hostage crisis in 79-80. I think how dismal it was. And
well, it was, but it's a bit unfair on Jimmy Carter to say he couldn't handle international relations, isn't it? After all, the Middle East Peace Accords, I mean, that was quite an achievement.
Yeah, but he left America in a far worse state internationally than he found it. And that's never a good thing for a president to do. Donald Trump did something similar, I fear. But it is... I just remember during that hostage crisis in 79-80, it was my first year at university, and all student politicians were following it very closely. And it just seemed as though America, whose impotence had been perhaps suggested by the debacle of the Vietnam War and the fleeing from Saigon in 1975, really was confirming itself as a non-superpower. And this is the depths of the Cold War. We've got Brezhnev still in charge, not just in Moscow, but running half of Europe. And it was worrying to many people of our generation that things were going so badly in America.
But in a way, that all played into Reagan's hands, because he was this sunny, optimistic figure in contrast to the malaise that Jimmy Carter talked about. And, I mean, I keep saying this, but optimistic politicians tend to win elections and pessimistic ones don't.
Yes, I think that's absolutely true. And as is well known today, I think real incomes in America have not increased since 1975. And America used to look like the land of plenty to us in the 60s and 70s. But right through the Reagan years, they didn't become any more prosperous. But what Reagan did, while not enhancing prosperity, was he restored a sense of self-confidence for the very reason you've said, that he didn't deal in pessimism. He only wanted to cheer people up and make people feel good about America. And I think he did that not least by subtly in his speeches and his approach to governance, redefine what America really meant, what America was. And having constructed that idea of America, which was partly the sort of Hollywood image of it that he'd grown up with, he made people believe in it so much more readily than they could believe in, whatever sort of America poor old Jimmy Carter stood for.
Well, let's go back to the beginning. And one of the fascinating things about your essay in the book is that you do spend quite a long time talking about his childhood, his time as an actor, because that all of the influences that he had then really led to the man that became president in 1980. So just tell us a bit about his childhood. Where did he grow up?
He grew up in a corner of Illinois in the Midwest, and his father ran a store, I think. They lived over a shop, certainly. He made a famous joke when he became president that he was glad to be living over the shop again when he moved into the White House. And he was quite an intelligent young man and got to high school and got to a pretty ordinary Midwestern university where he was very athletic. He was a brilliant sportsman. And he became very keen on sport and got a job as a sportscaster. This is in the early 1930s. He's born in 1911. And again, one reason why so much of my essay concentrates on his non-presidential life is he was 69 when he became president, so there was an awful lot to talk about. And he went with his local sports team to Hollywood to do some sportscasting and stayed there and auditioned to become an actor and got bit parts. And then eventually, because he was tall, dark and handsome and could remember his lines, graduated to slightly more serious films. He didn't make a great number of really good films, but he made 2 or 3 really good films, King's Row is the most famous, that made him widely recognised throughout America. He was never in the sort of Clark Gable, Cary Grant, Errol Flynn category of actor, but everyone knew who he was, and of course that had gave him great assistance later on when he ran for politics.
And he became a union leader, which you would never, I mean, thinking about how his later life developed, you would never have thought so. But what influence did that play in his political views?
Well, he was running the I can't remember what it's called now, the Actors Guild.
Screen Guild.
The Screen Guild. And so he was representing fellow actors and ensuring that they were well treated. Actors were a little bit like people who worked in the docks in this country under the dock labour scheme. It was a free-for-all whether you got any work. Many actors never worked at all. And so he did everything he could to ensure that those at the bottom of the pile in particular got a better deal. And, pardon me, he was there during the McCarthyite purges. And, I mean, some people have said of him that he was a sort of narc on behalf of the Republican Party in shopping people who had views about McCarthy and, about communism that McCarthy would have objected to. In fact, he was much more subtle than that. He was certainly a very proactive American, but he never actually, I think, dropped anybody in it who hadn't dropped themselves in it quite publicly already. And what he learned from the Screen Actors Guild was that he was a good political organizer, and that he liked the cut and thrust of politics, and it gave him a taste for doing something on a wider stage. But of course, if you pardon the pun, but of course he was active in the Screen Actors Guild, I think, right through until the late 1950s. And by that stage, he's nearly 50 years old. He's becoming quite old to get involved in national politics for the first time. But having been a successful convener of this union, which so it's not a conventional trade union of working class people, but a trade union of often quite privileged people, he has a stab in 1966 at becoming governor of California.
He got married to Jane Wyman in the 1940s, but they divorced fairly soon after that. But it's interesting that they still remained on friendly terms, and she was very supportive when he became president. Obviously, he then got married to Nancy Davis. And he spent, I mean, sort of late 50s, early 60s, he became a bit of a TV star as well, doing these films for General Electric.
Yes, he became General Electric's man in the media, if you like, and was making adverts for them. But it was also the president of General Electric, I think, who took him aside and said, you've got real potential as a serious politician. And they helped bankroll him to start with. They helped support him. Nancy Davis, later Nancy Reagan, who was, like Jane Wyman, an actress, but unlike Jane Wyman, not a very successful one, also believed very strongly that Reagan had the ability to go right to the top, and supported him both on the way and when he was there in the most devoted way imaginable. I mean, when people think back to Dennis Thatcher and other spouses of heads of government in this country, I don't think anybody's ever done quite so much, quite so assiduously as Nancy Reagan did.
And he spent the first part of his adult life as a Democrat, but then switched to the Republicans in the late 1940s.
Yeah.
And you say in the essay it was largely under Jane Wyman's influence.
Yes. And of course, the Democratic Party and the Republican Party were very different 70-odd years ago from what they are now. It was only really by the time you get to the era of JFK that the Democratic Party starts saying, well, actually, maybe we should be a bit nicer to black people. Maybe we should allow black people to be equal with white people and actually be allowed to vote in large parts of the country. It's been the Democrats who have held up the progress of black people all the way through really from the Civil War, and the Republicans who have taken a much more colourblind approach to the way that black people
Which is not the way people think now, is it? People imagine it's the Republicans who are what the Democrats used to be.
Yeah. And I can see why. I mean, of course, there were these people when Reagan stood for office who became known as Reagan Democrats. They were people largely from the South who'd always voted Democrat, who said, well, actually, Reagan is articulating our vision of politics much better than the Democratic Party. And but I can see why, whether Jane Wyman's influence or not is important. I think, as you say, it was. I think that he left the Democratic Party because it was no longer articulating what he believed to be the soul of America, really, which was, if you like, a sort of enterprise society, long before the phrase was used over here, and an enterprise society that by definition has to involve everybody and can't go around engaging in ridiculous acts of colour prejudice, which is what, sadly, the Democrats were doing right up until the late 1960s in some cases. I mean, never forget that I think it was not until Newt Gingrich's contract with America midterm elections in 1994 that the South actually voted Republican in large quantities. And the fact that the South always voted Democrat, and that actually, and I don't think I'm libeling anybody by saying this, the Ku Klux Klan largely voted Democrat, was they believed the Democratic Party was going to stand up for a sort of white America policy at all times. And the South changed. The South became more Republican. But you're quite correct. In these days, we think that if there's any sort of bigotry going on in American politics, it's in the Republican Party. I think that's a slur, actually. I don't think that's entirely fair. But certainly in Reagan's generation, when he moved to the Republicans, it was the Democratic Party who were the backward-looking party.
When did he first become a nationally recognised political name? Was it, I mean, he supported Barry Goldwater quite vocally in 1964. Was that the start of his sort of road to a national program?
I think it started before then because of America's fascination with Hollywood and because of Reagan's own celebrity in the 40s in particular as a film star. I think his work with Screen Actors Guild really made him a household name. I think people knew exactly who he was. And of course, as you said, he was on TV all the time from the late 50s onwards as the front man for General Electric. So he was a very well-known figure in America. It's rather like the way that Donald Trump went on their equivalent of The Apprentice and became very famous before he ran for the presidential office in 2016. So certainly Reagan's support of Goldwater in 1964 was indicative of his belief that he was a national player. But I think he had been recognised as such before then. And also, of course, he's planning to run in the gubernatorial election 2 years later in California.
But that could have backfired for him because Goldwater massively failed. He was seen as a very right-wing candidate, and anybody associated with that campaign could have disappeared into political obscurity, but Reagan didn't.
No, Reagan didn't. I think because he never ever associated himself in any speech he made with any of the more extreme views that Goldwater had. I mean, if you had been an American voter in 1964 and you were faced with the choice of Goldwater or LBJ, there would have been quite a lot of reasons for you not to vote for LBJ. And of course, LBJ had inherited the presidency just under a year before the election of 1964 because of John Kennedy's assassination. And he was a man probably, if John Kennedy had done 2 terms, would never have run for the presidency. He would have been 60, I think, in 1968. He wasn't in good health, and he exhausted himself, not least by his machinations in the Senate, where he represented Texas. And he got the presidency in tragic circumstances. And I think in 1964 there was a great headwind behind him, if that's not a mixed metaphor, to give him an election victory in his own right because of JFK and people feeling sympathetic towards the Democratic Party. So I think Goldwater was always on a hiding to nothing. And again, Goldwater seemed to be articulating something that the Democrats in the late 50s, early 60s had shaken off, particularly about society and social politics in America. But Reagan's ability not to identify with that, but always to speak about fine American values, particularly freedom, was what always counted for him, I think.
So he won the California governor race in 1966, stayed in that post until 1974. What did he really achieve as governor? I mean, that's quite a stint, 8 years.
He kept things quiet. I mean, that sounds like an insult. America was in a state of real turbulence. I mean, there were tremendous student protests in California, which Reagan had to order to be put down. He was always a brilliant judge of what most people wanted. This is why he was such a successful president. It caused outrage that he oppressed student riots or ordered them to be oppressed in quite the way that he did when he was governor. And he knew that it was controversial, but most Californians supported him. And he was also very careful in his rhetoric about the Vietnam War, which was the big issue at the time and was provoking many of the student riots at the time. And he just got on with a sort of stable form of governance where people were largely left alone to get on with their lives. And that's the model that he took to the White House with him in 1981 when he became president. He certainly wasn't. He was a memorable governor of California in that he was Ronald Reagan, and he won 2 terms. California is one of the biggest and richest states in America. It's bigger than most European countries, and he ran it with great confidence and aplomb. What he learned there also, I think, was he learned how to take advice. He was very good at surrounding himself with intelligent people and wise people and people of political experience who gave him the right advice and told him, how to get on and act. And in a predominantly, even then, liberal state, and I use that term in the American sense, he managed not to frighten any horses, rattle any cages, whatever other cliches you want, and left with not just with his integrity intact, but also having built a political reputation, and obviously ready, as he did in 1976, to try and contest the Republican nomination.
It's very interesting also that many of the personalities that we remember from the Reagan cabinet, Caspar Weinberger, I think Ed Meese, George Shultz, they were all in his cabinet in California, weren't they?
They were, and again, it's not just a question of having intelligent, experienced, high-quality people giving you high-quality advice. It's also that you form relationships with them and have a basis of trust with them that you can take forward with you if you go further in politics. And that's precisely what he did. And again, it's another reason why his White House ran so well. Whatever he may not have achieved as president, he may not have transformed America in quite the way that his own publicity suggests that he did. He ran a pretty tight ship, and it was not least because of what he'd learned in California, and that he took people from California with him to the White House to help repeat the experiment.
Now, he did consider running for the presidency in 1968 when Nixon got the nomination, but he didn't. And then in 74, he decided not to run for governor of California again, clearly intent on presumably wanting to be president. Failed to get the nomination in 76, but only very narrowly against Gerald Ford. And then, of course, we move forward to 1980.
Yeah. I think Reagan should count himself lucky that he didn't get the nomination in 1976, because although President Ford had the unenviable task of being the man with the bucket and shovel after Watergate and cleaning up after Watergate, he didn't make the best job he could of it. He did come over internationally as being a bit sort of bumbling and detached. Obviously, very nice man. And, he used his family, particularly his wife, to very good effect. But he was never, I think, going to win the 1976 presidential election. And I'm not sure that any Republican would after the Nixon legacy. I think there was a mood in America in 1976 that whoever was the Republican candidate had to take some sort of vicarious punishment for Nixon over Watergate. And Ford had, of course, been Nixon's vice president in his second term. And he took it. And the Republican Party was still a synonym for sleaze during the 76 campaign, even though Gerald Ford himself was utterly clean and tidy in that respect. So I think Reagan was lucky not to get it, because I think if Reagan, who was then aged, 65, had fought the 76 election as the Republican nominee and had lost, there'd have been no way back for him. He'd have been too old. As they said, you've already failed once, why do you want, you're too old to try again. And the Republican Party would have moved on a generation, probably to George Bush. Who knows what that would have meant for America and indeed for the world. So I think Reagan was very fortunate that he didn't get the nomination in 76, and also that he made a very public show of supporting and endorsing Gerald Ford so that his loyalty couldn't be questioned. And then, of course, once Ford loses, Reagan effectively, quietly, stealthily starts campaigning the day after the November 76 election, because he knows he's going to try and get it the next time. And the fight he has against George Bush for the nomination in 1980 is far more straightforward than the fight he had against Gerald Ford. And also, memories are actually quite short. By that stage, Watergate is 6 years earlier, and nobody really cares about it. The Republican Party has had a complete change of skin, if you like, in between those two events.
Let's move on to his presidency. We talked a bit about how he became president. What were the challenges facing him upon taking office in January 1981, and how did he deal with those challenges?
Well, the great domestic challenge was the economy. Interest rates were stratospherically high, and America, as I say, was slightly stagnant, or very stagnant in terms of prosperity. And what Reagan really wanted to do, I think, was to get people taking risks again and encouraging what Mrs. Thatcher at the same time over here was calling an enterprise economy. And so he had to get inflation down, and he wanted to change the nature of the burden of taxation. He wanted, he understood, as Mrs. Thatcher, his contemporary over here, did, that there are some times where you put taxes up and you take less revenue as a result. And he believed, if you cut taxes, we will generate more revenue. And to an extent, he was right. Certainly what he did by trying to cut taxes, which was, as I say, his great domestic project, was he encouraged people to take risks and found businesses and create jobs. And that was something else America needed. His international challenge, of course, was the Cold War, which had challenged every president since Harry Truman. And it was a question of trying to engage in diplomacy with the Soviet Union, to talk about trying to halt the arms race and pull it down. And that really, up to sort of the Reykjavik summit, up to the coming of Gorbachev, dominates American diplomatic behavior. After that, they begin to see that there's an opportunity of bringing down the Berlin Wall and bringing down the Iron Curtain and regularizing relations with Russia, with a different sort of Russia. And that happens really well. That starts to happen once Brezhnev goes. And Reagan is a very good front man for this operation, but it's driven partly by the State Department and partly by our Foreign Office. And in terms of the political lead, the intellectual side of the political lead is done by Mrs. Thatcher, without question. She and Reagan have identical beliefs, an identical loathing of communism, and an identical loathing of the Soviet Union, but she is always slightly better placed to articulate it than he is. And he willingly defers to her. Of course, although he is leader of the free world, technically, she's been in power for nearly 2 years when he gets into the White House. And although he is aware of his seniority in terms of the size of America and the size of the American armed force and the American economy, he does, in terms of looking for rational argument, always defer to Mrs. Thatcher, and that happens, I think, more than right the way through his presidency.
We'll come on to their relation in just a moment, but not long into his presidency, he underwent an assassination attempt, which could have ended very differently.
Yeah, he was, I think, leaving a lunch in Washington when someone shot at him, and he took a bullet. So did one of his security men, who didn't recover. And Reagan was 70 at the time, and it's probably not amusing to be shot at any age. To be shot at 70 is very difficult. A decision was made by one of his bodyguards in the car to take him straight to hospital and not back to the White House. The Secret Service men didn't know whether Washington was full of marauding men with guns who were looking to kill the president, and that if he'd been taken to a hospital, it could be a trap. But they decided to take him to hospital, and that decision saved his life. If he'd gone to the White House, there wouldn't have been medical attention swiftly enough to do it, and they saved his life. And he managed to tell jokes to the doctors and the nurses there to show that he was okay. When the surgeon came, he was going to operate on him, he said, "Well, I hope you're a Republican." And the surgeon, who was a Democrat, famously answered, "Today, Mr. President, we're all Republicans." And saved his life. And that remark by the doctor was interesting because it showed the unity of America. You wouldn't find that very easily today. It showed the unity of America in this attack on their head of state. And the political differences were put aside. This was an outrage that a lunatic had attempted to kill the president. But he was back at work properly within about 3 months, I think. And he obviously had the constitution of an ox, and he had brilliant medical attention and got it at the right time. But of course, had he been killed, George Bush would have become president nearly 8 years before it happened.
Going back to what you were saying about the relationship with Margaret Thatcher, do you think some people in this country overplay the importance of that relationship? Because there were occasions when they did disagree fairly dramatically. I think of the invasion of Grenada as one example of that.
Yeah.
And on nuclear arms as well.
Yes, and I think had Reagan been allowed to have a third term, they might have had an argument about German reunification as well. Mrs. Thatcher, I think, had certain characteristics that only someone who had been born and brought up in middle 20th century England could have. And I think she had an even greater fear and suspicion of European influence than Reagan had. Reagan's view was that Europe was just another one of his, or in those days, Western Europe, just another one of his allies, and he didn't bother about the detail of the minutiae. They were just to be counted in his list of friends. And I think that he found it difficult to understand what even then, in the early 1980s, was her sense of hostility and constant tension with the European Union, which of course was much smaller then than it is now. The invasion of Grenada really upset her because, of course, Grenada was a Commonwealth country, and therefore, as far as she was concerned, was within the British sphere of influence. Now, under the Monroe Doctrine, Grenada was very much in America's sphere of influence. And she was appalled. I think not that Reagan had sent troops in there to try and restore some sort of order when the political order was breaking down, but because she hadn't been consulted. And I think Reagan, from what I can make out, Reagan himself realised he'd made a mistake, that he could have sort of done it, but he should have picked up the telephone and said, I'm going to do it.
Because the Queen was and is head of state in Grenada.
Yeah. So it was, and I think that was a constitutional nicety that Reagan didn't quite grasp. So that went down badly.
But had she had a bit of a inkling into this kind of scenario during the Falklands War the previous year, where, I mean, Reagan, to be fair, was quite staunch in support of Britain, but many of his administration were not.
Well, Al Haig, who had been his Secretary of State, was very wary of doing anything to help Britain against Argentina. And of course, the very big Latino influence in America, hugely strong now, but strong even then, told against it. I mean, Reagan had the good sense to keep out of the Falklands. And I think when Al Haig was getting a bit out of control, to tell him to shut up, because he understood that this was British territory. I mean, America, under Reagan, and indeed under most of its presidents, pretends not to be an imperial power, but it is. And so one thing it does understand is when bits of your empire get knocked about, you might want to complain about it. I don't think Reagan... Grenada, I think, was 3 years after the Falklands. I think it was 1985.
It was 1983.
That may be a...
One of us is wrong.
One of us is wrong. I thought, for some reason, I thought it was 85. If I've said 83, it's a typing error.
Wasn't it Libya that was 85, or was that 86?
That was 86.
Mm-hmm. But, I mean, going back to the Soviet Union, obviously she played quite a crucial role in introducing Gorbachev to him, and that relationship was probably the most important one during those 8 years.
Yes, undeniably. Hugely important, because it begins the end of the Cold War. And it was only 10 months after Reagan left office that we were all watching on our television screens the Berlin Wall being dismantled, and the Honecker's border guards shrugging their shoulders as people went in either direction. And that was a tremendous achievement of the West. It was also a technological achievement. I remember someone saying to me at the time that people in East Germany were watching, beamed in through satellite television, Western German television programs, and realizing that West Germany was another planet in terms of prosperity and innovation and everything else. And morale broke. And where Reagan and Thatcher were so clever was they understood that this was the moment when morale was going to break, and they capitalized on it. And so, certainly in Germany, no shot was fired in anger. And then you have the domino effect going on around Europe, in Czechoslovakia, of course, Romania, Christmas Day 1989, the Ceausescu was taken out and shot. And Russian influence in Eastern Europe suddenly comes to an end within weeks. And they hang on in the Baltic states until 1991. The Baltic states rebel against them. And then Gorbachev has to give way to Yeltsin in late 1991. And this all comes from a determination by Reagan and Thatcher not to let that post-war status quo stand. And this is another thing that binds both of them together. They inherited certain political customs, if you like. In this country, we call it the post-war consensus. In America, it was the sort of legacy of Roosevelt's New Deal that was symbolized in the GI Act and gave everybody a leg up when the war was over. And both Reagan and Thatcher understood that by the late 1970s, early 1980s, the time had come to move on and to stop making exceptions for people, to stop in this country giving organised labour a say in what was going on to quite the extent it had had. And in America, Reagan understood the need to reboot the economy. He understood that America, which had once been a land of tremendous enterprise, going back to before the slump, actually going back to the 1910s and 20s, had to be revived in that way. And that really was what he did, and to an extent it became his legacy.
Reagan, I think, rather changed his view on the Soviet Union over those. Well, maybe not changed his view, but certainly changed his rhetoric, because initially it was all about the evil empire and saying things that were sort of on that level. And then he met Gorbachev. And then he became much more pragmatic. And I can't remember whether it was in your essay or something else that I've read recently, where it was explained to him that if he continued this rhetoric, the Soviets genuinely believed that he was going to attack them. And from that moment on, there was a much more moderate approach. And that culminated in the different summits and the arms agreements with Gorbachev.
Yeah, I think there's an element of truth in that. I think also that Reagan understood that when he came into power and was still dealing with Brezhnev, rapidly followed by Chernenko and Andropov, I can't remember in that order, that he was still dealing with the gerontocracy of the Soviet Union. I mean, these are people who vividly remembered 1917, albeit as schoolboys, and who had grown up under Stalin and understood the need for a disciplined ideology and complete control. And when he met Gorbachev and realized that Gorbachev had an understanding of the world outside the Soviet Union that Brezhnev, Chernenko and Andropov had never had, he thought, well, actually, I can, to use Mrs. Thatcher's phrase, do business with him. He isn't just going to sit there and spout ideological crap at me. And of course, with Brezhnev, who was thought to have been impersonated by stand-ins for about the last 2 years of his life because he seemed to be completely away with the fairies, that generation, the Brezhnev generation, people like Gromyko, who was his foreign minister, and others, they were determined to hold the line because they knew that once in discipline, whether of an ideological nature or of a social nature, came into Russia and into the Russian Communist Party, it was all over for them. The game was up. Because they knew how little money they had. They knew Brezhnev had just not like... Brezhnev, rather like Hitler, actually, had never worried about how the country was paying its way. It was just going to have an ideological project and was going to fulfill it. The fact that people were living in really substandard conditions, working in ghastly tractor factories the length and breadth of the Soviet Union, and that this workers' paradise didn't exist. Brezhnev just wasn't going to recognize it. Gorbachev did, and the fact that Reagan recognized that Gorbachev understood realities was what gave them a relationship.
Let's talk about Reagan's public image, because I remember the 1984 election campaign against Mondale, the most amazing, what we would call party political broadcast, the campaign commercials with Reagan and Nancy wandering sort of through sunlit trees and mourning in America. Then you had the Space Challenger disaster, was that 86?
That was 86.
Yeah, where he just rose to the occasion and gave the most brilliant speech. I mean, the words crafted by Peggy Noonan.
Yeah.
I mean, often a lot of his words weren't his words, but
Yes.
he was just a brilliant conduit, wasn't he, in many ways?
Well, he was a great actor.
Yeah.
He was, although King's Road was not a bad film, he was a much better actor as president than he ever was in Hollywood. And, I mean, again, sadly, I'm old enough to remember the terrible events of the Challenger space shuttle. And yes, Peggy Noonan found that poem, I think by a Canadian RAF pilot, from memory. And they were perfect words. Not only did very few people know that poem, but it was a beautiful poem. And it was an act of genius on her part to get him to say it. And he delivered it brilliantly. When I was writing this essay, I looked him up on YouTube. And it's overwhelming, even today. Okay, we're all human beings. We all share that sense of grief when young, brilliant people die in the way that they did in that disaster and terrible accident. But you don't have to be American, and you don't have to be a great supporter of Reagan to watch that and think the man's a complete genius.
Also, I remember the speech that he gave on the Normandy beaches at the Point du Hoc. I mean, the most amazing speech. To be fair, Clinton did a brilliant one 10 years later, but just captured the moment. But he also managed to use this rhetoric to get out of some pretty sticky situations. I mean, I'm thinking of Iran-Contra, where he sort of faced the cameras and said, well, people tell me I've done something wrong. I still don't think I did, but I have to accept that I did. And you think, how do you get away with that?
Well, yeah, Iran-Contra was the moment that I came face-to-face literally with Reagan. Because I was a junior leader writer on the Daily Telegraph in February 1987. And I went to work one day and the editor, Max Hastings, said, go home, get your passport and go to Washington. I'd never been to America before. So they expedited a visa for me, I think, and I was on a plane later that day because they felt that the coverage from there was not reflecting the enormity, and I use that word in its correct sense, of the wrong that appeared to have been done by Ollie North and others in shipping arms to the Contras. And yet when I got to Washington, everybody says, well, why is it a big deal? And I was amazed. I said, well, back in England, we're talking nothing else. And so when Reagan did come up and say, look, move on, nothing to see here, he was reflecting a view of most Americans. There were a few within the Beltway who said, oh, Jesus, this is a terrible thing. But for tens of millions of Americans, it didn't matter. And then when people started, there was Senator Tower, who ran a commission to investigate Iran-Contra. And when it looked as though this might be getting pretty close to the heart of the Republican Party, people would take journalists like me aside at press conferences and say, do you know which telephone was the first telephone to ring in Washington when I think it was Noriega's plane went down or something? It was George Bush's. And so there was it was as if George Bush had been running a freelance operation that Reagan didn't know about. But certainly huge lengths were gone to by the Republican establishment in Washington to try and keep Reagan out of this. And I think, to be fair to Reagan, he was out of it. I remember conversations I had at the time, this is nearly 35 years ago, everybody fingering poor old George Bush and saying, well, he knew what was going on. And then you had these ridiculous Capitol Hill hearings with Ollie North standing up there and being asked whether he'd ever slept with his secretary, who was an astonishingly beautiful woman called Fawn Hall, I seem to remember.
I remember. Yeah, because I was in America when those hearings were on, literally spent every day watching them. Yeah. It was an unbelievable theatre.
Riveting. Yeah. And Ollie North appeared to be, he kept saying, I keep being told I've got the most beautiful secretary in the whole of Washington and I've never slept with her. What's gone wrong? So it was, I don't know, the establishment in Washington, the Republican establishment, almost seemed to make this into a sort of semi-comic event. Something happens in a faraway country of which we all know little, and we've got our finger in a pie there, but so what? It's rather like the tactics that Boris Johnson's friends use in order to say that all his episodes of bad behaviour don't really matter. But I think in this case, the Republicans were right to. I think Reagan didn't have a clue what was going on.
No, in a way, his presidency was never the same again. It's almost a bit like Margaret Thatcher after Westland. You kind of thought, well, that's the beginning of the end, and it was here, wasn't it?
Well, don't forget, it was only 18 months before the election.
Yeah.
And he couldn't, after the Roosevelt Amendment, he couldn't stand again for president. So he was going in January 1989, come what may. And this all happened in February, March, April 1987. So he was, I'm afraid all second-term presidents become lame ducks by that stage in their presidency. Some, like Joe Biden, do it much sooner. But it's, Reagan was, I think, never going to amount to much after the middle of that. Which always struck me as a very good reason not to have term limits. If Reagan could at least have given the impression that he might seek a third term in 1989, even though he was 78 when it happened, it might have given everyone a bit more impetus to make his second term a bit better. But when you know it's coming to an end and you know how long it takes to get any measure through Congress, I think Iran-Contra, it was never the same again, but I think that wasn't the only reason why it was never the same again.
Now, he lived for 15 years after his presidency, but those years dominated by failing mental health with dementia. And he very bravely put out a statement telling the American people that that was what he'd got, which I suspect was the first time a leading politician had really ever done that.
I mean, he was, I think, when he died, the oldest president. He just overtook Harry Truman, didn't he? And then I think Gerald Ford overtook him. So, American presidents living to that age have been thin on the ground. And I seem to remember it was largely Nancy's influence. She wanted, which was a great campaigner for public health, she wanted the people of America to know that this terrible affliction that had affected so many Americans had also affected her husband. And so, yes, he put out that statement. And it further humanised him. All heads of government, particularly really powerful countries, are at a risk of demonisation, even if they do nothing badly wrong. But I think that softened people towards Reagan and made them realise he was a human being, and that the job he'd done was had now gone into the past. And I think it helped, although one shouldn't rely on pity to help one's historical reputation, I think it helped stabilise and secure his historical reputation.
Just finishing on that, and we've got to be quite quick because we only have the studio for about one more minute. In terms of his legacy, where does he figure in the list of the 45 American presidents?
Oh, I'd put him enormously high. I mean, in terms of legacy, I think actually Abe Lincoln, Harry Truman had a hell of a legacy. Roosevelt, oddly enough, didn't. I think Roosevelt, the New Deal didn't really amount to much. The New Deal didn't transform the American economy. It was the war that transformed the American economy. But I think Theodore Roosevelt to an extent. But
so in the top 5?
Definitely.
Okay. Well, Simon, I think you've whetted everyone's appetite. I'm sure they'll want to read your essay in the book. The book is called The Presidents. It's out now in hardback at £25, published by Hodder and Stoughton. Join us again next week for another edition of The Prime Ministers and the Presidents, or indeed the other way around. Goodbye.